name is Claire Leibowicz, and I lead the AI and Media Integrity program at PAI. And I couldn't have asked for a better tee-up to this conversation, where I'm joined by four wonderful colleagues who I'll introduce briefly, then spend a few minutes setting the stage for this panel, and then they'll introduce themselves in a bit more detail. So the furthest from me, we have Polina Zvyagina from Meta. I will let her pronounce that more eloquently, who is the global AI governance and policy lead there. She's then next to Vera Franz, who's the deputy director of the Open Societies Foundations. Then we have Caro Kriel, who's the CEO of the Thomson Foundation, and Laura Ellis in her natural habitat, the head of technology forecasting at the BBC. So I'm actually going to backtrack 4.5 years ago to set the stage for our discussion on elections and democracy and AI, which is a bit more narrow than I think these broader conversations we've been having about governance more broadly that touches all prongs of AI. And 4.5 years ago, we were in a much less modern BBC building. We were at Portland Place in the old broadcasting house, about to kick off a multidisciplinary conversation about AI-generated mis and disinformation. And Sam is smiling because he was there, and it was co-led with the BBC and Witness. And our multi-stakeholder community in the ice age of 2019, before the generative AI buzz, this year felt what we described as an emergent threat of AI-generated mis and disinformation warranted preparation, though not panic, as Sam so eloquently conveyed. And a week before that meeting, a now viral or canonical video of Nancy Pelosi was making the rounds, and it caused this kind of existential moment. We're an AI conference thinking about AI manipulations to artifacts, but here's this video in which a political figure is merely slowed down, and that threw a wrench in our understanding of what we really care about. So it prompted this question, which was, how do we create solutions for mitigating the impact of these kind of low-tech degradations to democracy or manipulation of narratives, while also preempting AI-generated content? And what was prompted from that discussion was several years of collaboration that culminated this year in a framework, again, a common theme, that focused on generative media. And one section of that framework talks about a specific harm that is manipulating democratic and political processes, including deceiving a voter into voting for or against a candidate, damaging a candidate's reputation, or influencing the outcome of an election. But of course, we're not just thinking about elections when we think about democracy, we're also thinking about persuasion, argument, representation, and all these other aspects of day-to-day life. So I'll turn it over to my panelists and let them kick things off with a question, which is, pulling this up, so we want to understand how AI will impact upcoming elections in the US and around the globe. I hope people know in 2024 we have a lot of elections. So we'll start with you, Vera, broadly, from your aperture as a funder, how you understand AI beyond just manipulated media to be impacting democracy and elections.
Yes, I think we have, thank you very much for the invitation. We have 2 billion people voting next year in over 65 elections. So it is a big, a big event. And I think AI will be consequential, has been in the past, but I think in these elections it will be playing an important role. And the big change I see is really a new, what I would call quality of distrust. And I think Sam just spoke to that eloquently, that while we saw, deception in the past, I think it reaches really a new level. And the fact is, all of us have now these anecdotes, and that is different, I think, from a few years ago. So just the other day, there was just one quick example, an audio circulating where Keir Starmer, political candidate in this country in the next election, abused staff, and literally one of our partners had to call his campaign team. Is this real? Is this fake? And his campaign team did not know and had to ask Keir Starmer whether it was real or fake. So that's the level, the quality of distrust, I think. And that from an open society perspective, when you think about that the public sphere is a space where we make the rules that govern us, our society, is of course a consequential development.
Maybe we'll go to the journalists in this section of the panel. Caro, if you want to go.
Thank you so much. So my name's Caro Kriel. I'm a journalist. I spent most of my career with AP. I'm originally South African, and I've always worked in international news, and I was actually based in Russia between 2012 and 2014. So I've seen a bit of disinformation in my career firsthand. At Thomson, we're working with journalists in really difficult places in the world to report from, where democracy is under threat, their lives are under threat. So I think for us, it's looking at these things coming together, especially next year, where you've got fragile democracies, you've got lots of important elections happening in important countries, you know, not only the US and the UK, but places like Taiwan, where the vote is really important, India, Indonesia, and so forth. You're seeing generative AI that's going to change disinformation. It might not be as bad as some people say, but I think we're safe to say there'll be more of it, and it will go further, and it will go deeper, and it will get better. And these things come together at a time where trust in media globally is often very low. And I'm not someone who feels pessimistic ever, and my motto is probably what Sam said. Actually, I wrote it down, you know, don't panic, prepare. But I think if you want to don't panic and prepare, this is the moment to do it. It's now.
I've got one. I think, is this okay? Yeah. I think we're edging into panic. Sorry, Sam. I think we are very slightly at the moment because it does feel so scary. But what's really reassuring is that we have people like Sam and like PAI and like all of you on this panel and many of you in this room. And I think one of the things that's really marked the last 4 years since we sort of first met has been the collaboration that we've seen between organisations which have been traditionally quite distant in some cases and quite competitive in others. And some of us are still quite competitive, but we still pull together on things like this. So I know Sam's got a deepfake rapid response team. The kind of work we're doing with the Trusted News Initiative, which, as you know, came out of the meeting that you've described, in getting people to be able to respond quickly is very reassuring. It's one of the most reassuring things in a time when there isn't much reassuring news going on. But I think for me, you know, particularly as we get into this massively peaky election year, the worrying thing is that I was on our Slack channel with some journalists yesterday, and somebody put up a piece of BBC content with a question underneath, is this real? And you know, I haven't seen much of that, but there was this genuine question because something didn't quite sit right with it, that immediately we were thrown into this sense of we're not even sure whether our own content is real. How can we check? Well, we've got our own recordings. But I think, you know, and I would say this, Claire, because, you know, I'm an obsessive about it, but I think one of the things that's going to be so important is provenance signals so that we can trace and track our content through this ecosystem and we can see where it's been manipulated and altered and where it's been completely spoofed. So I'm not going to panic, but I do feel quite nervous, and I don't normally feel this nervous about elections, but I really do now.
Polina, are you as calm at Meta?
Yeah, I'm super calm. I will provide the calm perspective. So I think, yes, generative AI is having a very significant moment, and yes, it is, and as AI already has changed society, and generative AI will continue to do so. So the way that I try to look at it now is that it's both a sword and a shield. And that the same techniques that are being used by threat actors and bad actors to perpetuate the, you know, falling apart of democracy or just misinformation or disinformation in the election context are also the same technologies that we have to use to fight it. Just yesterday, Safety Kit announced that, and it's a small startup, generative AI startup that's focused on trust and safety. And they just announced NewsGuard, which is a new feature that uses misinfo fingerprint databases, which are based on common themes that are being seen in misinfo and disinfo campaigns very quickly to automatically flag content. And that, is a technology that's only enabled because of Gen AI. There is multiple examples like this of other companies that are capable of these techniques. And as Lisa mentioned yesterday when talking about cybersecurity, the cat and mouse game with bad actors is ever present. And if we're going to continue to pursue the mice, then we need to use the same technologies in order to do that. And in order for us to be able to figure out and work together as a group, and as we have been in the steering committee on the framework and in the larger group, to figure out these issues of the liar's dilemma and why people can't necessarily trust the signals themselves and what other things. I know we're going to get into transparency a little bit later, so I'm not going to jump into that. But I do think that there's hope, and I think that technology will have the ways in which we actually solve a lot of these problems.
Thanks, Polina. It's interesting. The common thread here seems to be hazards in generative AI and disinformation. But I'm also interested in, one, are there just issues of scale or speed that will cause breakdowns in our election system? So I've heard an anecdote that a lot of election offices in the United States are nervous that people will automate freedom of information requests and they'll just be so inundated and they have to legally respond to them that it will break down kind of the institutional systems, for example, that we typically rely on. So even beyond the typical misinformation narrative, there are all these kind of unique use cases for people to degrade the rigor of our infrastructure for elections around the world. I'm curious, so do we think our current systems, you were talking, Polina, about these swords to deal with some of these challenges, and we could think of those swords as technologies, policies, other practices. Do we think we're ready for this threat, broadly defined, from AI on elections? And maybe we'll start with you.
Geez, I don't really want to make any promises here, but I think the shield is what I'm referring to. Like, that's the detection, right? Although, yeah, maybe we fight with swords. That's fine too. But one of the studies that we did, and we do this every year, so the Coordinated Inauthentic Behavior Enforcement Report, and we put it out every year. So we have seen the ability for AI, not just generative AI, but AI to be used to create fake accounts, AI to be used to create fake content, and signals from both fake accounts and fake content is used to identify whether it's coordinated and authentic behavior, and you can read about it in our report about it. And we do face determined, well-funded adversaries, and we think that LLMs specifically have a lot of promise in pursuing these types of threat actors. So already we've caught a lot of coordinated and authentic behavior, and our classifiers are working, and because we're combining signals from both the content and the accounts themselves, it's possible for us to catch them already, but we do also continuously improve our systems to use LLMs to be able to do this, to be prepared for the election.
Caro, from the journalist standpoint, do you think, and around the world, do you think we're ready for whatever election year will bring?
Well, I think there's a lot of good work that's been done in big and small newsrooms. I mostly worked for big ones, but now we support smaller media organizations. But one of the places in the world that we work is in Western Balkans and Central Europe. And Slovakia is one of the places where we've got quite a strong network. And some of you might have seen the story that's been in the papers about the deep fake. And I couldn't resist my journalistic instincts. So I actually spoke to the journalist whose voice was used in this, Monica Todova, and the editor of another newspaper and a technologist. It was really fascinating to me because Slovakia is not a big place, right? But it is very tech smart. It's very alert to Russian disinformation because they've been a target of it a long time. So these people are novices, and they've struggled with it. And some people think it has had an impact on the election. Others say it hasn't. But whether you think it has had an impact on the election or not, I think what really resonated with me when I spoke to these three people were, first of all, that people thought that the deep fake, this audio recording, just created a wave of distrust 48 hours before the election. Crucially, and this kind of, I didn't really realize the significance of this until I spoke to someone inside the country, but because this deep fake was released 48 hours before the vote, there was a moratorium on reporting. So the independent media couldn't just go and refute it, right? So it takes time for the platforms to react and to take a time and for the government to do something. But whoever released it specifically because independent media couldn't do anything about it then. I think that's quite scary. And the final thing that one of our partners, the media editor, said to me is, I don't know if it had an impact or not, but I can tell you that I think now you can deny anything. So if you had Donald Trump before saying that's fake news, his point is now you can say it's deep fake news. And I think that is the concerning bit around this stuff.
And Vera, to be a little more saccharine, do we think that there's any promising policy or practice you've seen to deal with some of these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, before talking about the policy, I think I want to also emphasize that sort of where we are today as opposed to a few years ago in terms of how we're protecting. So I hear you on SHIELD, but I think the reality is as well that a lot of where this content will actually reach millions and billions of people is on the distribution channels. So that is on our social media. And we as open society are quite discouraged that some of these social media companies, including Meta, have, seem to be deprioritizing election protections. So for example, YouTube announced that they would no longer take down election denial, but also I understand Meta sort of walked back from banning political advertising, allowing people to opt out of fact-checking. Again, you can verify, you sit inside, I sit on the outside. So I'm just saying that is the context we're in, and that is sort of the United States. OSF works with groups protecting elections around the world. So we are funding a big coalition of 120 NGOs working for democracy and elections. They've come together in a coalition called the Global Coalition for Tech Justice, and they have written to TikTok, Meta, Google, and who am I missing? Meta, to sort of create election protection plans. And this coalition has not to date, as far as I know, gotten an answer. So I'm just saying, I want to set that context as that's the context we're operating in. And unfortunately, one can, sort of try and discuss what created that change from sort of aiming to at least protect to now seemingly deprioritize that. There may be the mask factor, undeniably. Culture war, I'm sure, is an issue as well, especially in the United States. So anyhow, I'm just presenting the reality that we're dealing with next year. And then, yes, I can talk a bit about the policies. Sorry, I'm going on for, cut me off in my, so in terms of mitigations, I think there are at least 4 entry points. So there is the model construction, the LLM construction, the access point, the dissemination, that's the social media, and then there is the trust in society. So this is journalism, good journalism, this is digital literacy, all these points. And I'll focus on the dissemination because that's the one I know best. But as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of frenzy now around, creating guidelines, rules, etc. My experience in the past 2 decades working on tech accountability is also that guidelines, and we've heard this earlier today, have always limited impact, right, if they're voluntary. I talked to a very senior trust and safety person from a social media platform who left recently the other week, and he basically said, social media will deal with synthetic content if they're forced and not otherwise. So if that is in a meaningful way, so if that's where we are, I look around the world and the only binding rule I see is the Digital Services Act. because that was adopted in October 22 and will be enforceable from January 24. So in terms of these upcoming elections, that is a tool we have, and I think we should use it to experiment with it. The last thing I'll say, how does GenAI intersect with the Digital Services Act, if this is the sort of one, the most promising lever we have? Clearly, it does not cover GenAI standalone products, but it does cover every GenAI product that's integrated in a large online platform or large online search engine. And that matters in terms of the distribution again. And then, of course, it also covers content that's generated with AI that is disseminated. So I think there is a big overlap, and I can talk more about this, but for me, that's one of the most promising levers. Enforcement will be an uphill battle, as always, but it is a binding tool we have.
Thank you.
Sorry again.
No, it's great. And I think elections, for those who are more generally interested in misinformation policy or generative AI policy, is an interesting kind of bellwether policy lever, both because in the US, where we typically have more open speech laws, elections is kind of one of the only contexts where we do have specific boundaries on certain speech that is not allowed if you interfere with the process of voting and some of that stuff. And two, politicians care, presumably, about the fact that they may be deep-faked, and they want to kind of counter that threat. So it's maybe a strategic angle also to motivate change. Laura, maybe to go into an intervention you're very familiar with, how do you think about transparency around AI as it relates to elections and democracy, both as a media person and someone thinking at the standards level?
I mean, that's a great question, and it's something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. Those of you who are familiar with our CEO, Deborah Turner, she's come in on a transparency ticket, basically, and hence I love Polina's idea that we're all pursuing the same mice, so we need aligned cats. One of our lovely cats is our Verify unit, which is a really multidisciplinary unit that's been formed from all kinds of bits of the BBC, our trending teams, our data journalists, some of our technology people, and some of our people who do explainers and reality check. And it all fits together, I think, really well, because one of the things that preoccupies us is not only giving people transparency about where the news they're seeing has come from, in whatever way we can, and explaining how it's been made, and who we spoke to and why we spoke. So transparency on every level, but also talking to these groups about, talking to our audience about the intent behind disinformation and misinformation and why that might have happened. And I think that's something that sometimes, particularly in the scurry around elections, and they are, elections are nothing more than a whacking great deadline. You don't have the choice of going, well, we'll debunk that tomorrow. It really is urgent. And I think, a lot of our election law, I don't know if this is the case everywhere, but certainly in the UK, we have this wonderful quaint thing, don't we, the day before, where all you can show pictures of is dogs in polling stations. I'm looking forward to the first fake dog. But currently that just feels incredibly sweet and gentle and old-fashioned. And we're now up against this terrible kind of deadline to make sure that if something does happen in a very sort of time-critical phase of the election, we need to be able to debunk it quickly. So having the transparency and then having this work around intent, I think they go hand in hand. And there's a wonderful European project, the Horizon Fund, looking at the intent behind disinformation. And it comes back again and again to media literacy. How do we educate our audiences, along with ourselves, about why things might be appearing, as well as what they are and whether they're fake or not? And I think we've got a long way to go on that. I think we found that something like 73% of information on X at the moment around, misinformation rather, around the Israel-Hamas situation. Is it 73% is coming of the fake? I can't remember the exact percentage, but it's like scary amounts of information that we're seeing on there is fake and is not being challenged. And I think, it's that kind of environment that we live in, and that sort of toxicity will infect our elections inevitably. The more we can equip our audiences, and I love the Xander van der Linden, the guy from Cambridge who talks about inoculation and sort of pre-bunking, the more we can inoculate them to look at the things they're seeing and to help us, identify them and flag them up, but also to question why they might be seeing this sort of strange things that they're seeing if they are indeed having those questions. And, you know, I think it's going to be much more of a partnership with our audiences to make sure that that intention is evident.
Polina, go ahead.
100% agree with everything you said. And I want to just add a couple of other mechanisms where I think transparency is important, and also at various layers of society, right? So yes, tech companies, we have a huge obligation for transparency, which is why, you know, so much of our work related to AI transparency is out in the world, from how we develop our models to how we launch them to the AI system cards to explain how generative AI technology even works, so that people can start to engage with those artifacts a little bit more. But also, you know, media companies have been really good about exploring generative AI specifically and teaching consumers about that. And there's other players in the field that should be doing the same, because we all reach different classes of consumers with all these artifacts. And so actually one of the best moments that I've seen recently, as I was in a car with my kids listening to a podcast that they listened to called Wow in the World, and they had an episode on AI, and it was the best explanation in an image generation that I've heard in like ever. And I now feel like I understand it better, and I work in this field every single day. So just like empowering our youth, empowering children, empowering teenagers, empowering college students to understand how the technology works, so that they don't feel like they're victims of the technology, but that they can be participants in the technology.
If I can just add on the trust, I mean, I think that's why you see big media companies coming out and saying, this is how we're going to communicate with our audience about Gen AI, what we're doing with it. And I think that's really important. It's not only important from a building trust with your audience point of view. You know, you have to be really honest with your audience as a media provider about where the content comes from. But from a sustainability point of view, it's vital, because it's really important, bringing the conversation back to democracy, that we have sustainable, independent, trustworthy media organizations, whether they are in London or Bratislava or Moscow or wherever. But it's a really important pillar of this challenge.
So it's interesting because we've used the term AI transparency to say to viewers or listeners that content is AI generated, but sometimes we use that term to refer to content that's misleading or not factual. And we're hearing these threads of AI transparency sometimes as a proxy for telling people what's true and real, which is a whole other business that a lot of institutions understandably don't want to get into. So in our framework, which I'll go back to, which we launched in February, and that was a few months before the White House voluntary commitments, which basically echoed our recommendation on AI transparency, we differentiate between two types of transparency. One we call indirect disclosure, which is kind of these embedded technical signals for indicating and following, as Sam was describing, a piece of content over time. And some are these kind of audience-facing signals, which are what do we want to say based on knowing that that piece of content arrives somewhere. So I'd love for us to think about that. You know, this AI transparency idea is the policy intervention, I say, du jour in many circles, because you're not actually saying anything about the content itself or the semantics of the content, just the fact that it's manipulated. So what do you think about these both technical methods for transparency as it relates to elections, and also what it means for end users? Maybe Laura, if you want to explain a little bit about what you've been up to.
So I'm going to cheer you up about that last one, because there is some cheering news. We've not released this yet, but I'm going to talk in vague terms about it. So we have done some research, vague terms. We've done some research into the extent to which provenance signals in content help people to trust.
And what is a provenance signal?
So a provenance signal would be something like what you've just described. So I've just dropped my glasses. So something like what you've just described, which is putting signals into content to show, thank you so much, where it's come from, and so who it's come from specifically. And then also, it's not just a binary thing. It's not just, yeah, this has definitely come from the BBC, you're fine. It's allowing you to drill down and see other elements of metadata within that piece of content. And we have found that in our very early audience testing, allowing people to see detailed metadata about a piece of content gives them a much greater trust in the news organization that's provided it, which is exactly what we set out to do. So without trust, a news organization, like us, like any news organization, that believes in impartiality and truth and facts, and I hope that's most of them, maybe, without that, we're nothing. And we literally don't have a business model. So having that kind of positive response to securing our content in a way that none of us wanted ever to have done. Did we really want to do this? No. Do we have to do it? Yes. But now that we are doing it, and we are so sorry now that we are doing it, and we're having this kind of this conversation about how important these signals are, the fact that we're getting some early indication that this will be a success and that audiences will be helped to trust and to understand what they're seeing and to have faith in it, if they, that at least it is coming from where they think it's come from, the organization they have chosen to trust. We're not making any judgments on the truth of it. Anybody can use these signals, but it has come, unmolested, if you like, from where you think it's come from, and giving those reassurances in very early audience research says that that's going to be a help to us. So we need to build on that. We need to keep doing the research. We need to do more research, and we need to work out exactly what the best way of expressing those signals, and you've done a lot of work on this, gosh, you've lived this, what the best way is.
And how do we make sure that we don't prompt people to be too skeptical of content? I don't have an answer to this. It's a provocation.
Yeah, I also don't have an answer to this, but it is a question because we have content that we use our own AI tools to create, or creators are able to use those tools to create that content, and that's one mechanism. And then people can share content on the platforms, and there could be underlying steganographic techniques or metadata that we have the potential to read, but there's not currently a consistent approach in which different different news agencies are labeling that content, or in the case of other generative AI companies, how that content is labeled. And so right now the field is very across the board, and I know that you're doing a lot of work to try and herd a lot of these opinionated cats, as Mado talked about yesterday. But it is a really challenging problem, and ultimately a lot of the people that we're talking to are good actors, right? Or at least we're trying to be good actors in the atmosphere, and bad actors will not put any kind of signal. And what we don't want to do is create this atmosphere of trust that, okay, any generated content will have these labels, will have this way for me to know, and therefore anything that doesn't have it must be real. So that's the kind of liar's dilemma issue that I know you're doing a lot of research on.
Yes,
and I love any answers you have.
Plug that we are going through a very methodical technical briefing series on all the different types of media authentication efforts if you're interested in getting involved and debating these in more depth. So Vera, what else do you think governments can do beyond advocating for transparency?
I think provenance is important, and I'm not, there are experts in the room clearly on that. So I think it's a worthwhile effort. I also understand it's technically a very difficult problem, but we need to stay at it. And so the interesting question around that is, not, as you said, because it's generated with AI doesn't mean it's deceptive, right? So I think that's the additional complexity in that space. So then there are conversations about, for example, political candidates making pledges that they will not use content generated with AI in their campaigns. Anyhow, some may do that, but again, the moment you think about it, and this is the interesting piece about our space, it falls apart the moment you think about it, because of course, many political candidates, as we know, use, outsource, exactly, right? So, and then those wouldn't be bound by it. So, so you go solution by solution, and none of them really, I think, gives us the confidence. I think we should try everything, of course, but personally, I believe I'm most worried about the amplification. So it's like the right to speech is not the right to reach, and again, if a piece of content that's deceptive or hateful is online is not the problem. The problem is if it reaches many people. And so I think that is really where we need to sort of, look at the systemic impact. And again, laws that ask social media companies to assess the systemic risks for societies, including elections. I think that's the way to go. And then think about mitigation measures that are, again, systemic and not a whack-a-mole, let's go after every single hate, full talk, but let's look at the algorithms, let's look at our content moderation process. So I think that is how we can have best impact, to be honest. Or look at inauthentic, right? One of the developments we'll see, content will be much cheaper to produce. So we'll see a proliferation of actors that will produce disinformation and hate. We'll see it at a greater scale. It will be harder to detect because inauthentic, influence operations were often copy-pasting. Right, but with Gen AI, you don't have to. You can produce millions of slightly different copies, and then some of our detection mechanisms wouldn't catch it. So there are some new qualities, and again, I think systemic approaches.
And to bring it back to regulation, it's interesting the recommender system challenge that gets sometimes, I think, now obfuscated in the generative AI narrative. There are regulatory activities, or the court case in the US with Google and ostensibly about social media is going to have impact on how recommender systems work too, which is algorithmic amplification. So there's all this web of AI policy that doesn't typically get interconnected. So a 30-second answer lightning round. Brevity, I hope, is your strong suit, not mine. We will ask you what the Partnership on AI community can do together alongside policymakers to help fortify our elections in the era of AI. This is a very funny moment when she knows the answer. Thank you, Jeremy Holland. Laura.
So 30 seconds. I think, again, it's pulling us together. It's pulling together the people, the right people in the room who can have these conversations and advance the things that we all need to do around transparency, around disclosure, and around trying to use our combined expertise to give audiences the best shot at something which has become a bit of a luxury, which is trustworthy content that they can absolutely vest their faith in, and can understand when the content that they're seeing might not be of that nature.
We'll go down the line.
Yes, I would say collaboration, but make sure that it is beyond boundaries, across the Atlantic, and that it's not only about technology. Because as much as I like provenance, global standards do concern me because it's, very difficult to enforce. So I think this is also about strengthening truthful media wherever they are in the world.
Thanks. Given PAI is a multi-stakeholder community, I think bringing together, understanding the concerns of those fighting for fair elections in South Africa, Taiwan, Moldova, and so on and so forth, with some of the companies that can actually do something about it. I think that would be good.
I agree with that one. I was going to say something similar, where you guys have this unique opportunity where you already have the synthetic media framework, you have the guidelines for the safe deployment of foundation models, or at least a starting point of that. And there's also, the data team here that works on a lot of very important work. So I think aside from just transparency, what are the you can gather bodies together to come towards, like, what are the things that we can all do together in preparation for the election? What are some of the best practices on classifiers, how they work across different languages, how to make sure that voting machines aren't subject to a lot of the issues that potentially they could be. So I think just coming together and bringing stakeholders that all care about this in the same way.